Republicans and Democrats have been spending a lot of time blaming one another for the debt and the deficit, even as the government reaches the debt ceiling limit and they prepare to spend more on infrastructure and other projects. To help us sort through all those numbers, we welcome Douglas Holtz-Eakin. He's president of the American Action Forum and former head of the Congressional Budget Office. So, Doug, thanks so much for being back with us. Before we get to the debt, which I definitely want to talk about, do you have a reaction to the $1.5 trillion number? Is it a surprise? Does it make sense to you?
It's not a big surprise. We always knew that it was going to be something lower than 3.5 and substantially lower. I guess one of the questions I'd have is that 1.5 in total spending to be offset by 1.5 in total taxes? Because he's mentioned in the past this should be paid for. So that would really dramatically change the shape of what has been proposed. And there are really two routes to get to 1.5. You could make some tough decisions about what's in and what's out. So, you know, Medicaid expansion in, Medicare new benefits out, or you could cut everything down to a fewer number of years and less generous in the way of money. And so how they get to 1.5 is just as interesting as the number.
Yeah, so we did hear an awful lot about the debt and the deficit and the hearings that were going also up on Capitol Hill involving Secretary Yellen as well as Chair Powell. One of the questions that Secretary Yellen was really pressed on is what becomes unsustainable in terms of our debt. And she essentially said, I'm not going to give you a number in terms of dollars. I'm not going to give you a percentage of GDP. It depends on the debt service and how low the interest rate is. What's your reaction to that as the former head of the CBO?
This has become a sort of parlor game about your favorite debt sustainability metric. But whether you look at debt relative to GDP, the nominal interest cost relative to GDP, the real interest cost relative to real GDP, the sad reality is all of them turn north at some point and head straight north in the long run. So by whatever metric, we are on an unsustainable trajectory. And so making that worse is not a good idea. What is on the table in the House would make it worse. There's no question about that. They raised $2 trillion in taxes, but they only stop having long-run deficits by sunsetting the programs. If you put it on an apples-to-apples comparison, this is a big increase in the structural deficit and not a wise move at this point in time. And they're trying to avoid having that honest discussion with the Congress.
Okay, so Doug, let me put that back together with what we were talking about, the $1.5 trillion now we've heard of Joe Manchin. If it is $1.5 trillion and they have like $2 trillion in new taxes, does that make you feel better about the deficit?
Yes, because then you've got something that looks like you're really matching the new program with the financing for new programs. That's certainly way better than what we've seen come out of the House committees. It doesn't solve all the problems, though. Remember, we have an existing structural deficit. We had an unsustainable trajectory before we got into the pandemic and these new programs. So what becomes of Social Security? What becomes of Medicare? What becomes of the existing Medicaid? All of which have big financial problems. No one's really talking about that.
Well, in fairness to Joe Manchin, he actually has referred to it. Part of the reason why he said yesterday that going ahead with the plan as it was being talked about was fiscal insanity. He said, we're not paying for Social Security. We're not paying for Medicare. We're already running deficits. So it sounds like he at least is raising that issue.
I think that's wonderful to hear. On both sides of the aisle, there's been a complete conspiracy to turn a blind eye toward the outlook on the federal fiscal front. And that's simply unfair to the beneficiaries that rely on those programs. It's unfair to future taxpayers who are going to get hit with sharp increases with no warning unless some real reforms get done and get done soon. So I'm happy to hear somebody raise that from any party on either side of the Capitol.
Doug, I also want to come back to the debt ceiling because that got a lot of discussion at the hearings today as well. We hear from Secretary Yellen it's going to be something like October 18 when we actually start defaulting on the debt, which the United States has never done in its history. How close can we get to that date before it starts really doing some damage in things like the credit rating in the United States government?
Well, we've tiptoed up toward that date in the past, and what you usually see is some fairly severe financial market jitters. You see people not wanting to be holding treasuries should that horrible moment come, and so rates start to bump up in advance of even a default. You have some liquidity problems because treasuries are the liquidity that make international financial markets go, and so you don't want to come too close to that date. We've already seen that. As for the credit rating, we're AAA, but the Standard & Poor's has put the U.S. on a negative watch. They are looking for evidence that the U.S. cannot effectively govern its finances, and this would be piece of that evidence, and that would risk downgrade yet again.
At the same time, the Democrats do have it within their power to put this all to bed, right?
Yeah, they do. You know, this is raw politics. Neither side has the moral high ground. Democrats do have the ability to do something that is necessary and wise, and Republicans are arguing they're using that reconciliation ability to do something unnecessary and unwise. At the same time, Republicans did contribute to the bill that has to be paid by raising the debt ceiling. So no one has the moral high ground here. They're just trying to jockey for political advantage.
Okay, thank you so much. Always great to have you with us, and particularly today. That's Douglas Holtz-Eakin. He's American